So, planet Earth can be divided into 5 main climate groups that can then be subdivided into 13 or 14 climate zones depending on who you ask. But you're listening to me, so it is 13. Yes, I'm going with 13. Sure, they can easily be divided further into about 30 climate zones, but that complicates things too much for the purposes of this video. Anyway, these 13 major climate zones usually cover vast swaths of continents, from deserts to tropical rainforests to polar ice caps. However, there is one place where the majority of these climate zones, 4 out of the 5 major climate groups, and 8 of 13 climate zones all exist in extremely close proximity. That place is the Big Island of Hawaii, or Hawaii. Before we jump into exploring all 8 climate zones of Hawaii and the ecosystems and human history attached to them, let me explain how we are defining the different climate zones, because having some basic definitions is generally a good idea in an educational video. So perhaps the most widely used way to classify different climates scientifically is the Köppen climate classification system. This was first published in 1884 by climatologist Vladimir Köppen and has been continuously modified and refined since then. The important thing to remember about this climate classification system is Köppen was also a botanist, and so the Köppen climate classification system was identified and defined based on primary vegetation, because Köppen noticed that all over the world, similar vegetation types grew in areas that had similar precipitation and temperatures. Because the Köppen climate classification system is ultimately based on vegetation types, it correlates quite closely with the concept of a biome, which divides up the Earth's surface not directly based on temperature and precipitation, but on the animals and plants that inhabit them, which often share characteristics due to the shared pressures derived from precipitation and temperatures of the place they're adapted to inhabit. That was some circular logic. How are these at all different concepts? But I guess they are? Anyway, Köppen gave each different climate a letter code, the first being the climate group. For example, the tropical climates are the A group, and a second letter which defines the climate zone by precipitation. And though we really will not be talking about further splitting up these zones, some climates have a third letter which usually represents temperature distinctions. Anyway, let us look at Hawaii and 8 climate zones found on just over 10,000 square kilometers of the island. You might be wondering, however, what climate zones are missing from the Big Island? I am so glad you asked this question, so I can explain all of the Köppen climate types, including the ones we won't be visiting. So, of the 5 main climate groups, the only one not found on this island is the continental climate, which is good because it would be pretty confusing if under your climate classification system, an oceanic island had a continental climate. This main climate group also has 3 of the 5 climate zones not found on the Big Island. Those last 2 missing zones are the winter dry temperate climate and polar ice caps, despite this not having always been the case, as during the ice ages the high summits of Hawaii were inglaciated and not only temporarily snow-capped after big storms. But I'm getting ahead of myself. A potential follow-up question to ask would be, why of all the places in the world does Hawaii's Big Island have so many different climates? Another great question. Well, it really comes down to elevation. With 2 roughly 4,000 meter mountains, tropical climates can exist at sea level, temperate climates can exist at mid-elevation, and alpine tundra can exist at the summits. The elevation also helps make the differences in precipitation between windward and leeward more extreme. On most islands, it is normal for more precipitation to be deposited where the prevailing winds meet the land on the windward side and less on the leeward side, but put nearly impassable peaks in the way, and suddenly the windward side is a tropical rainforest where it rains nearly every day, while the leeward side is a rain-shadowed desert as dry as any other on Earth. With most of the basics out of the way, let's begin our little climate road trip of Hawaii, starting in the town of Hilo and the tropical rainforests that surround it. I am here in the tropical rainforest, the tropical wet forest of Acre Waterfall State Park. Absolutely beautiful. Got streams, waterfalls, giant bamboo, lots of non-native plants, but really beautiful. Rainforest, a good illustration of sort of that jungle, that kind of climate. This climate is known as Tropical Continuous Wet Climate, and on Hawaii it almost wraps entirely around the island in a thin band of steamy rainforest, but is most extensive on the windward side of the island. Because this climate is most often associated with rainforest, it is very warm and very wet, defined by places with an average annual temperature of at least 18 degrees Celsius and receive an average of at least 60 millimeters of precipitation each month of the year. The continuous rain and tropical sun of this climate allows for the growth of forests filled with exotic flora. When most people think of Hawaii, they think of sun, sand, and tropical plants. Plumeria, monstera, banyan trees, bird of paradise, coconut palms, and pineapple, all tropical plants heavily associated with Hawaii, but are not actually native to these islands. Before humans arrived at the most remote island chain in the world, new species arrived only rarely as dictated by island biogeography. I mean, Hawaii has only 2 native species of orchids, less than any other US state, less than even Alaska. The plants that did make it here, however, are usually found nowhere else in the world. But while some native plants still survive in a few patches at low elevation, most of what you will find near the beach or on a dense forest trail is not. For those who want to be introduced to some uniquely Hawaiian flora, don't worry, we'll be talking about them later in this video as we go to higher elevations. Changes to the flora of these islands really began when the first Polynesian wayfinders arrived with canoe plants, a collection of plant species from Southeast Asia and the Pacific that had seeds or rhizomes that could easily be stored aboard an ocean-going canoe that could be grown and established as a crop on a new island. Many of these plants now grow wild on Hawaii, some of which have now become naturalized. That is, they fit into the ecosystem, not really out-competing the plants that arrived without the help of humans. However, the handful of canoe plants pales in comparison to the onslaught of exotic species brought as a result of European colonization. Something you can see clearly at Akaka Falls State Park, which leads you through winding trails in a jungle made up of a botanical community cobbled together from across the tropics. Which, even though I'm not the most familiar with what many plant species are specifically, it is kind of confusing because you see a plant I associate with my time in the Amazon rainforest or the Costa Rican cloud forest, next to plants I know come from Indonesia or Australia. The challenge with a plant community made up of so many species alien to these volcanic islands is that some invariably are hyper-competitive and have the potential to outcompete and replace the native forests around the island, which is bad. Unfortunately, removing an invasive plant is next to impossible once they become established, and sadly, vast swaths of these islands have been completely altered by invasive plants. People are just the worst. We can't help but facilitate the arrival and establishment of new species. Stop it! Stop bringing more crap to remote islands. I said stop! We next travel to the tropical savanna climate zone on the southwestern coast of Hawaii. Found primarily on the southern coasts of the island, this climate is defined by having an average annual temperature of 18 degrees Celsius, like those in other tropical climates. However, for at least 1 month of the year, the average amount of precipitation is under 60 millimeters, forming a distinctive dry season. On the west coast, that driest month is in the northern hemisphere's winter, while savanna climates on the southeastern coast have their driest month in the summer. Surprising based on their close proximity, but as this video attests, the Big Island really packs those climate zones right in there. While many are found in the other climate zones, several important cultural sites on the Big Island are on these slightly drier coasts. On the west coast is one of the best preserved pu'uhanua, or place of refuge. Until the early 19th century, when Europeans really got a stranglehold on the Hawaiian people, these sites played a very important role in Hawaiian culture. When a person broke a sacred law, the kapu, which was punishable by death, if that person could make it to one of these sites, they would be safe, as nobody within the boundaries of a pu'uhanua could be harmed. And here the kapu breaker could also be forgiven. These sites also offered a refuge during times of war, as a family could go to a pu'uhanua and be assured, regardless of outcome, that they would not be harmed by the fighting. On the southeastern part of the island, on the coastal lava flows from Kilauea, Petroglyphs were carved into the lava centuries ago. Among the representations of people and island life, there are a series of holes in the lava. These were made as a place each person in the village's umbilical cord could be put when they were born. And so these little dots in the rock each represent a person who lived in this area all that time ago. A powerful reminder of the people who first lived on these remote volcanic islands.
Well, there's one more tropical climate zone on Hawaii, and that is the Monsoon tropical climate zone, which is only found on the extreme north. It's now mostly home to eucalyptus forests.
The final main tropical climate subcategory, both on Hawaii and the rest of the world, is the tropical monsoon climate. This is perhaps the smallest and most restricted climate zone on the island, only found in a small strip of the northeastern coast. Again, average annual temperatures are at least 18 degrees, however precipitation is a little more complicated. Like a tropical savanna climate, at least 1 month of the year has less than 60 millimeters of precipitation, but essentially has to either have a less pronounced dry season or more rain during wet months to be distinct from a savanna climate, which is what happens when you base a climate classification system on plants and you have a vegetation type between savanna and rainforest. Guess you have a different climate. #not arbitrary. These groves of eucalyptus are actually more meaningful than a bunch of non-native trees. These are actually a plantation. These trees are allowed to grow until they reach a size that can be harvested for their wood. But they are not the first major industry to occupy these slopes. This forest is growing above what was once sugarcane fields, replaced after the Hawaiian sugar industry collapsed as cheaper sugar reached the world markets. Despite its near-complete absence today, sugarcane has shaped the history and politics of these islands like nothing else, except maybe US military strategy, though even that is tied to sugar. Sugarcane was originally brought as a canoe plant, but when the islands were connected to an increasingly globalized world after James Cook stumbled upon them, sugar began being grown on an industrial scale. And due to a consolidation of power, the sugar companies pressured the Hawaiian monarch into trading ownership of Pearl Harbor to the United States in exchange for the removal of sugar tariffs, and soon only 5 companies controlled the Hawaiian sugar industry, and so the Hawaiian economy, and so the government, all owned by foreign companies and the children of missionaries. They enjoyed that power, so when faced by a new monarch, Queen Lileuokalani, who wanted to strengthen the power of native Hawaiians on their own lands, this class of wealthy foreign businessmen overthrew the government and eventually used their mainland connections to get the United States to annex the islands. And now the entire Hawaiian sugar industry is essentially dead and left behind a once sovereign country annexed by an imperial power and essentially now is just trapped with a tourism economy. This history is something tourists to these islands need to remember when visiting these islands, and honestly, all citizens of the United States should also know this. It is now, at this point, I realize this is not going to be a lighthearted video about climate zones, because the story of this island chain, both historically and ecologically, is pretty sad. We now leave the tropical climates of Hawaii and head into the island's arid zones. There are 2 main zones in this climate group, both of which are found here. First, we'll be heading into the semi-deserts just north of Kailua Kona.
Hello and welcome to Semi-Desert. Now, it may look really lush, and that's because there's enough water to grow a lot of vegetation, but it's fairly dry. Of course, it's not too hot because we have the Pacific Ocean right here to help cool everything down.
This is hot semi-desert, meaning the average annual temperature is at least 18 degrees Celsius. However, unlike the tropical climates, the amount of precipitation defining the climate is a bit more complicated and involves some math. You love math, right? Especially in what is essentially a Hawaii travel video? This complexity seems to also explain why hot and cold arid climates are often kept as one zone. Anyway, you take the average annual temperature and multiply it by 20, Then add 280 if 70% of precipitation happens in the warmest 6 months, 140 if 30 to 70% of precipitation happens during those warm months, or nothing if less than 30% of the rain occurs during the warmest half of the year. This number we just calculated is the potential evapotranspiration threshold value in millimeters, or how much water plants will put back into the atmosphere if given enough water. If we take this value and find that the average annual precipitation is between 99 and 50% of our potential evapotranspiration threshold, then we have a semi-desert. On the Big Island, this climate is only found on the leeward side of the island, just northwest of Mauna Kea. While rainwater is more scarce, brackish lagoons along the coast allow for the ideal habitat for some of Hawaii's native wetland birds. Seeking food in the shallows, native Hawaiian stilts, eio, use their long beak to pick out small invertebrates. Considered imperiled, they are threatened by predation by introduced mammals, as well as degradation of these coastal wetlands because resorts, golf courses, and suburbs have to go somewhere, I guess. Paddling around in the same habitat, one can find Alekia, a species of coot that is also threatened, again by invasive predators and loss of wetlands. Omnivorous, they pick through the invertebrate bounty and wetland vegetation. On the other side of the dune buildup is the surf and a complex landscape of rock pools. This is ideal for even more native species. A KKK, or ruddy turnstones as they are known in the rest of the world because they usually roll over small stones or probe under algae for morsels. Also looking for bits of food here is the kolea, a beautiful plover, which is one species Polynesian wayfinders used to locate landmasses on their voyages across the Pacific and likely led them to these islands. As the sun sets, one final native bird makes an appearance. Flying from nearby roosts, aku'u'u descend on the coast to hunt for fish and crustaceans in the rock pools in the fading light. Watching this nightly phenomenon, I was reminded why this bird is called a black-crowned night heron on continental North America. It is just harder to see them go out to start feeding in some inland wetland among the vegetation, but it is just fascinating and stunning to see these birds backlit by the beautiful Hawaiian sunset. Like the other native wetland birds, loss of their habitat and predation are a threat to these birds' survival, especially of eggs and chicks. Hawaii, though, has even drier areas than the semi-desert, true desert. Remember all that complicated mathematics we did a few minutes ago to calculate the potential evapotranspiration threshold? I mean, yeah, I would probably also actively try to forget that math too. However, if we take the potential evapotranspiration number and find that the annual average precipitation is less than half of that, we have a desert. This is a hot desert as the average temperature is at least 18 degrees Celsius. This climate zone is rather restricted, sandwiched between the semi-desert and the sea.
Well, this is how you know you're in the desert. There's a subdivision over there with all kinds of tropical plants growing. Because that seems to be a common theme in deserts, is people just sort of wasting water. Well, this is hot desert. It's very sparse vegetation. There's very little rainfall here, even though the Pacific Ocean is just over there, which keeps it nice and cool, but also very windy. But yeah, there's very low rainfall because this is true desert.
Like with all the exotic plants, Hawaii is now home to an odd collection of introduced birds, hailing from all over the world. Northern cardinals from North America, skylarks from Europe, saffron finches and parrots from South America, gray francolins and common myna from India. Non-native birds have invaded and live in nearly every climate zone. However, one of the strangest non-native birds is restricted to the true desert, chestnut-bellied sand grouse, which of course I only got one picture of because birds be tricky to find sometimes. These are super neat birds widely distributed through the deserts of Africa and the Middle East. They have special breast feathers that are super absorbent, which allows them to carry water from watering holes to their chicks, which the birds raise deep in the desert to keep them safe from predators. They were introduced to Hawaii by the Nevada State Game Department because they wanted to potentially introduce them into the Mojave as a game bird, and so somehow got the state of Hawaii to allow them to run an experiment to see if the birds could be established outside their native range, which they did, but localized only to the most arid parts of the island. So I guess yay for the Nevada State Game Department. I'm so glad a random idea a random Western States Game Department had for a game species resulted in that species being introduced to one of the most remote and fragile ecosystems on the planet. Anyway, onwards, and now, upwards. Now we begin to climb at elevation, leaving behind the coasts and places with annual temperatures above 18 degrees Celsius. We are entering temperate climate zones. There are 3 major subcategories of temperate climates in the world, 2 of which are found on Hawaii. First, we will go to the summit of Kilauea, perhaps the most active volcano on Earth, to explore the continuous wet temperate climate. Hello, and welcome to a different climate zone. This is continuous wet, warm, temperate on the summit of Kilauea in sort of native Hawaiian rainforests with a nice ohia canopy. We've got tree ferns, false staghorn ferns, which can be kind of scratchy if you're trying to break through them. And so, yeah, we're at pretty high elevation, like 4,000 feet above sea level. Or I know, I unfortunately, like, I try to use metric system, but it's hard to, I'm terrible at putting them together. Anyway, as you can see, we are up on the crater rim of Kilauea. Actually, we're sort of on the rim of a smaller crater, Kilauea Iki, with the primary Kilauea crater on over there on the other side. You can see the volcanic gases and steam rising out in front of Mauna Loa. Temperate climates have an average annual temperature less than 18 degrees Celsius, but the coldest month has an average temperature more than -3 degrees Celsius. To be classified as a continuous wet temperate climate, average monthly precipitation must be above 30 millimeters. This is one of the island's most widespread climates, almost fully encircling the island at mid-elevations in the cold, drizzling rain and fog, except for the extreme leeward side of the island. At these cooler elevations, native flora still comprises a significant part of the plant community, especially the dominant trees of the forest, which are the koa and the ohia lehua. So here we have a koa. It's like bent over in a funny way, so it's growing along the ground, but it makes it easier to reach the leaves, which is exciting. This is a typical koa leaf. Koa is one of the primary canopy plants in Hawaiian rainforest, that and ohia. And its leaves are these big banana-shaped, kind of sturdy leaves. That's the typical koa leaf, which is kind of unusual because they're actually in the family Fabaceae. They're a leguminous plant in the genus Acacia. Now, those plants are generally known for having pinnate or bipinnate leaves. And if we go down here, we have bipinnate leaves. These are young koa leaves. And if you notice, something unusual is happening up here. The petiole is sort of ridging out. It's sort of expanding. So what happens is the petiole expands into this blade banana-like leaf, and then the little leaflets that make up the bipinnate leaf fall off, leaving only this banana-shaped leaf, which is the petiole, not the leaflets, which is so like crazy that they kind of go through this. But it's a very distinctive, unique sort of transformation that the koa goes through, which is so cool. Here we have some beautiful ohia growing out of A'a. This was in a lava field all that long ago, but there's already a little ohia forest. This plant makes up, is along with koa, one of the main canopy plants in sort of Hawaiian continually wet forest. And has beautiful flowers. It's a beautiful plant and very adaptable. It has tiny little seeds that just get into any little nook and cranny in these
The ohia will grow out of rocks, out of other trees, even sort of man-made structures. They're really, really adaptable.
Unfortunately, a deadly introduced fungal disease caused by 2 different fungi species is ravaging the ohia. The spread of rapid ohia death seems linked to the presence of wood-boring beetles and introduced ungulates, allowing the fungal spores to spread and enter healthy trees. Which is why it is important to clean your shoes with bleach before entering these forests, because shoes are disgusting vessels for all kinds of microbes and the seeds of invasive plants, and only time will tell if the ohia-dominated forests of this climate zone will persist. The other temperate climate found on Hawaii is temperate summer dry, which is globally quite rare. This climate is defined by an average annual temperature under 18 degrees Celsius, with no monthly average temperature under -3 degrees Celsius. However, the driest month of the year is in the summer and has an average precipitation of less than 30 millimeters. On Hawaii, this climate is found in the interior and leeward mid-elevations, and we will be exploring it around the saddle road that runs from Hilo to the western coast between the peaks of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. Habitats in this climate zone are home to some of the rarest species on the island, which is why the United States has a bombing range up here. Thought that's what Nevada was for. So glad after annexing a sovereign nation, the United States started using it for target practice. Okay, the rare species are found just outside the shelling range, and the actual widespread problem on this part of the island for endangered Hawaiian nature is introduced grazers such as goats and pigs, which have destroyed native dry forest and unique high-elevation plant communities. On the southwestern slopes of Mauna Kea, in a forest dominated by the leguminous mamane tree, you can find the critically endangered palila. A beautiful bird, the combination of in situ and ex situ conservation has kept this species from disappearing forever. However, they only survive in one tenuous population. Further up Mauna Kea grows the unusual Hawaiian silverswords, or ahina, a critically endangered plant, most of which are protected by fences put up and designed to keep out non-native grazers, and thus allow these plants to reach maturity and develop their large flowering spike. The careful work of conservationists in this precious ecosystem helps ensure a future for these and other rare mountain dwellers. But for us, we must now head even further upwards.
Look, it's the world-famous Beware of Invisible Cows sign.
Finally, we arrive at the Big Island's 8th and final climate zone, tundra, which might be a bit unexpected on a tropical island. Tundra is one of the 2 polar climates, the other being the ice caps. These climates are simply defined as having no month of the year with an average annual temperature over 10 degrees Celsius. Tundra is defined by having an annual temperature between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius during the warmest month. On Hawaii, tundra is restricted to the high elevation slopes and summits of the 2 massive volcanoes, Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. Anyway, let's climb Mauna Kea to see snow in Hawaii.
Well, part of the slopes of Mauna Kea. You can see the snow up there, which means we don't have too far to go till we're in proper tundra. I think we are in tundra now. There's very little plant life and it's rather cold, but we'll save that for when we get to the snow line. Continuing up, it is very desolate. There is some grass. I'm surprised, even as high as we are, that there is plant life, but there's some grass, and I've seen some ferns poking up here and there, which is pretty cool. A bit further to go, not too much further before hitting some of the cool areas up here, but it's like Mars. Like, there's areas I've been through where it's like, there's like grass, so there's some comforting of plant life, but there's places where it's like, it just feels like I'm on Mars. It's a crazy place up here.
Near the summit, this is an almost alien, plantless world, but life still finds a way at these elevations. The wind blows dead insects upslope, where they are used as a food resource by small invertebrates living under the rocks. These book lice are feeding on some sort of true bug. Of course, I really wanted to find and film the Waku bug, which is only found at the very summits of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. But today their entire global range is underneath a blanket of snow and ice, and so inaccessible to search. But seeing the summit of a tropical island draped in an icy blanket of snow looks better for the video.
The Wiku bug is a creature of mystery. Well, I'm walking through hiking through a snowfield right now. But here, we're on Paraglacial, which is a tundra climate. It's cold and lake is right there. The summit of Mauna Kea, I think it's a little over there. Yeah. But welcome to the Paraglacial climate. Well, made it to the summit of Mauna Kea. It's a frozen landscape out there. The rainforest is down there in the clouds. I'm in the shadow of these enormous telescopes, night sky, space stuff. That's actually the true summit over there. It's a sacred site though, so can't really go there. But this is the highest point any goofball can walk up to. But yeah, we made it up through all of the 8 different climate zones of the Big Island. It was quite an adventure.
As the highest peak in the island chain, the summit is sacred to native Hawaiians, and in ancient times only nobility was allowed to climb to the peak for special ceremonies in this place closest to the stars. However, the summit was irreparably changed when an astronomer from the University of Arizona arrived to do some tests on the summit. Looking for an ideal place to build large permanent telescopes, he found the location ideal. He coerced the then governor to bulldoze a road to the summit and built a small telescope. Wanting a larger one, funding from NASA was sought, but the University of Hawaii also tried to secure funding, which they were awarded, causing the Arizona astronomer to abandon the summit in a fit of rage, feeling that the University of Hawaii had stolen this mountain he felt personally possessive of. "Oh, I'm so sorry the local university got to have a telescope in their own backyard. Didn't realize it would hurt your feelings, even though you only sort of considered the feelings of the native Hawaiian community, and just didn't put a telescope on the very highest point of the mountain." Soon though, telescopes started proliferating. Some native Hawaiians were rightly pissed off by this development. People in Hilo also didn't like seeing these reflective white domes on the summit of a spectacular mountain, and due to all the endemic and endangered species around Mauna Kea, environmentalists were concerned. This has led to road blockages and protests. But despite that, Mauna Kea has the most telescope observatories in the world, with 13. Today, because the United States Science Academy wants to stay competitive with the extremely large telescope project European scientists are building in Chile, a massive telescope is being planned. This was temporarily blocked by the Hawaiian Supreme Court, however, it is probably going to be built. The thing is that while there is significant opposition to the observatories, most Hawaiian residents actually support the construction of more, and the native Hawaiian community is also quite split, with just a slim margin being opposed to the construction of this big telescope. At least it does seem that the plan is to strike some sort of compromise, get more voices at the table, and reduce the overall number of telescopes, as the original UH telescope is going to be decommissioned and taken down, with the plan for only 9 telescopes to be active by 2030. Probably 9 too many for those who oppose them, but this is a complex issue, and a reminder that the need for transparency, due diligence, and outreach by scientists are kind of the bare minimum, especially on stolen lands. Now, since you are watching a climate video, and this channel at least tries to have strong conservation and environmental themes, you know a video on climate classification inevitably has to discuss climate change. In the last 30,000 years, the island has lost glaciers at the summits of the volcanoes, and so a 9th climate zone. That, though, is part of a natural interglacial cycle. The global climate is now being affected by the burning of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. Because the Köppen climate classification system is so widely used and makes really nice maps that show the distribution of different climates, several climate scientists have taken potential climate models and mapped how it will cause shifts in annual precipitation and temperatures around the world, thus predicting the future Köppen climate classification of Earth's land, And since these climate zones correlate so tightly with biomes, we can also get an idea of how ecosystems will change. The basic trend is places will get warmer and drier. And just with looking at how averages have shifted since 1950, nearly 6% of the land on Earth has changed to a warmer and drier Köppen climate category. And it is predicted over the next 100 years, 30 to 46% of the planet's land will become that much warmer and drier to change their classification. These trends have already started to be observed on Hawaii, especially in the temperate continuous wet climate zone. These areas of Hawaii are now receiving less rain, and this will have devastating consequences on what are the last, mostly native ecosystems on the island. Especially at the higher extents of this climate, this is a refugia for native forest birds. These birds are restricted to these forests because they have little to no immunity to avian malaria, brought to the island with the introduction of exotic birds and spread by invasive mosquitoes. These tropical mosquitoes have some difficulty invading and vectoring disease at higher elevations. However, a warming climate means they have an easier time infiltrating these areas, aided by a drier climate. Usually, high amounts of precipitation wash out the stream beds that crisscross through the forest. A drier climate, however, means less frequent rainstorms, which means water can pool in the drying creeks. Standing water, mosquitoes can lay their eggs in and allow for populations of these vectors to establish, creating an existential threat to most of Hawaii's remaining native bird biodiversity. Protecting these birds in the face of this threat, though, is a topic for a different video. Before we end, I also wanted to make some notes about this video. The idea that the Big Island has the most different climate zones is often talked about on travel websites, and this number can range between 8 and 10 different climates depending on which article you read. The complexity is not helped by the modern Köppen climate system utilizing about 30 categories, of which Hawaii really only has 9, with the temperate summer dry being broken into a cool and warm distinction depending on elevation, and while tropical savanna can be broken into summer dry and winter dry, they tend not to be differentiated in the most used global maps of Köppen climate distributions. While Hawaii still boasts a bunch of climates, including every tropical climate and the rare cool summer dry temperate climate, saying 9 out of 30 is not as impressive as 8 out of 13. It is also important to reiterate the Köppen climate classification system is not the only way to classify climate zones, and has plenty of criticism, especially that the different subdivisions of temperate climates are still too broad. This is why there are 2 major variants of the Köppen climate system, those being the more widely used 1954 Köppen-Geiger variant and the 1966 Trewartha climate classification. But there are other climate classifications not related to Köppen at all. Some are simple like Holdridge life zones, others are kind of complicated like the Thornwaith climate classification system. Anyway, with all that said, thank you so much for watching this video. This has been a topic I was intrigued by when I was first told the Big Island had all these different climate zones, and now we have gone on this journey to visit them all together. Tell me in the comments which was your favorite climate zone. Anyway, if you liked this video, I guess give it a like and perhaps check out one of these videos. If you are watching this in the near future, there should be videos further discussing the critically endangered species on the slopes of Mauna Kea, because I am not done talking about Palila or silver swords, because they are both really amazing species and are ideal for discussing in situ and plant conservation, respectively.